Hello everyone, and welcome to Plastic Subsidies 101 by the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP in collaboration with Hidden Plastic. And thank you as well for sharing your poll results. My name is Zara, and I'll be hosting today's session. I'm 16 years old and the co-founder of Hidden Plastic, alongside my brother, Ashton.
Hello, I'm Ashton, and I'm 14, and I started Hidden Plastic with Sarah, and I'll be the technical moderator for today, as probably already guessed. So if you have any questions about anything, then I will be in the chat. Back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ashton. And Ashton and I have also been observers at INC's 2, 4, and 5 of the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, where we were 2 of only 4 under-18s to have ever taken part. And we'll also be attending INC 5.2 later this year in Geneva. We've been involved as young people because we know that by the time Ashton and I are adults, there will be 3 times as much plastic pollution in the environment as there is now, if we don't stop it now. This treaty is humanity's greatest chance to end this crisis, to ensure that my generation and the generations to come inherit a safe and livable planet. The science has shown us that we really do no longer have the time to waste. I'd also like to note that Hidden Plastic is launching a petition to call for the INC chair to reinsert the language needed to address plastic subsidies in the treaty text. But more on that and how everyone can help at the end of this session. We've also created 2 videos on the importance of plastic subsidies, which is why we were asked by CYMG, or the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP, to host this webinar. Before we dive in, some quick housekeeping. We hope you feel comfortable to keep your cameras on. However, I would like to point out that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So while it's wonderful to see all of your faces, if you'd prefer not to be recorded, we suggest you switch your cameras off. Also, can I please request that you keep yourself muted at all times, unless you're asking a question during the Q&A session at the end. If you have a question for one of the speakers at any time, feel free to ask in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end. It looks like we don't have a Q&A box in hindsight, so in the chat, that would also work perfectly. In today's session, we'll be hearing from Shellen Sailing of CYMG on the role of youth in addressing plastic subsidies, Ronald Steenblick on the definitions and how plastic subsidies currently function, followed by Dr. Alexandra Harrington on how plastic subsidies could be addressed in the Global Plastics Treaty text. And for our final speaker, we're pleased to have with us the Deputy Lead Negotiator of the Panama Delegation, Kervin Lanyas, on Panama's position on plastic subsidies and the potential for plastic subsidies as positive subsidies as a force for good. Finally, we're aiming to have as much as 30 minutes for Q&A at the end, and this session should conclude before that hour-and-a-half mark. We're very excited to have all of you here today, and welcome. So, ever since INC2, Hidden Plastic has been working closely with today's co-organizer, the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP, you can see up above in my background, or CYMG. CYMG is doing some incredible work, and I'd like to pass the mic over to Shellen Sailing, who is the current interim chair of the soon-to-be-launched Youth Plastic Action Network, YPAN, a new youth constituency dedicated to plastic pollution and the future treaty. She's been involved in the INC process since INC3 as a leading force behind CYMG. Her work has included designing and organizing the first edition of the Youth and Stakeholder Assembly, or YSA, as well as the second edition to happen at INC 5.2. You may also recognize her from the MEA Bootcamp. Shellen has also been working behind the scenes with others to amplify the voices of those youth who cannot attend INC 5.2 in Geneva this August. Over to you, Shellen. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Zara. And I see you edited my bio there a little bit. So thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. I see many familiar faces from the MEA Bootcamp, and also many familiar names from the Inc. 5.2 youth group chat. Hello, it's great to put a face to the name of all my absurd text messages. So I can't wait to meet many of you at INC 5.2 in Geneva in August. So as Zara gave the great introduction, I am part of the Children and Youth Major Group, and we are launching the Student New to Be Youth Constituency, the Youth Plastic Action Network. The Youth Plastic Action Network was originally started it's been a journey at INC4 when several organizations, including my own organization, Waves of Change Coalition, came together and decided, inspired by many other processes such as the UNFCCC process that has Young Go, as well as the CBD process, the biodiversity, which has the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. We recognize how big and important this treaty is, especially for future generations. And as a result, while CYMG has covered plastics for a very long time, even before Resolution 5.14, we also, with other organizations, have recognized that there needs to be its own dedicated youth constituency that is purely focused on plastic. While CYMG definitely, as we all know, has focused a lot of time on plastics and has a lot of work. I'm actually coming off of an all-nighter from working on plastics. That there simply needs to be a dedicated youth mechanism for plastics, which is where now the soon to be launched Youth Plastic Action Network comes in, which will hopefully serve as the future youth mechanism for youth to engage, not just on the ground, but really globally. A lot of us, including our Zara, as well as I and others, recognize that it is a privilege and an honor to be representing millions of young people at the INC. And as we've been trying to do increasingly more and more, bring the voices of young people to the INC, as well as to these spaces that we have the privilege to attend and be part of. So thank you so much. And I'll post information attending YPAM. With that, also, I'd like to officially announce that we are doing the Youth and Stakeholder Assembly at INC 5.2 with the International Secretariat for Water, along with the Swiss Development Agency for Cooperation, which is a very exciting collaboration that we are very excited to be part of, which will happen on August 4th in person from 3 p.m. onward. And we look forward to sharing more information as well as the registration link within this chat period. Unfortunately, as I said, it's only for in person, but we would love for you, we continue to have many other events online if you can't attend in 5.2 in person. Thank you, Zara.
Thank you very much, Shellen, and very kind of congratulations as well on the YSA. Very excited for this. And I'd like to mention as well that with hopefully one final global plastics treaty negotiation to go, global plastic subsidies, which amounts to around $45 billion each year, are as relevant as ever. INC 5.2 will likely mark the final chance for the addition of plastic subsidies in the treaty text, so it seems essential that we understand how they work and how the treaty could be used to regulate them. So, without further ado, we're pleased to have with us today the man who is responsible for bringing to our attention the scale of plastic subsidies globally, including the statistic I just mentioned. As the lead researcher of the groundbreaking CUNA report on plastic subsidies, Ronald Steenblick. He serves as the Senior Technical Advisor for the Sustainable and Just Economic Systems program at the Quaker United Nations Office, or CUNO, in Geneva, where he contributes his expertise on a pro bono basis. Ronald's research focuses on identifying and estimating environmentally harmful subsidies, particularly those directed at fossil fuels and plastics, and supporting global efforts to reform these subsidies. Before joining CUNO, Ronald had an extensive career at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, where he was the Special Counselor for Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate until his retirement in November 2018. In this role, he led the OECD's fossil fuel subsidy reform initiatives, guided interdisciplinary teams at the nexus of trade and the environment, and chaired the G20's voluntary peer reviews of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you so much for joining us, Ronald, and welcome to Plastic Subsidies 101.
Thank you very much, and good evening or afternoon, good morning to everybody here. It was very kind introduction. One thing I do wanted to point out though is that the work that we've done on trying to identify and quantify the subsidies is actually a joint effort with our partners, Eunomia Research and Consulting, which is a consulting group in the United Kingdom, and that we've worked with very closely. And in fact, they did a lot of the modeling and estimation of the price subsidies that go into that $45 billion a year figure. And also working together with Andres Naranjo, who's on this call, is my colleague at the Quaker United Nations office. So just to give credit to all the people involved here. So let me share my screen. I have a screen. I have a hopefully not too long PowerPoint presentation, and let's see. So that's share here. Good. I hope everybody can see that. Let me go back here. So what I'm going to try to do is just give a broad overview of explain what we mean by subsidies in this context, and their nature, how they're provided. What we've been concentrating so far on is subsidies to primary plastic polymers. So these would be what end up as plastic resins before any other chemicals are added, and in the numbers that you'll be hearing about, we're not counting, for example, in subsidies upstream of the main stages for the production of primary plastics. Those are much larger, but include a whole lot of activities that are not directly related to plastics. So what do we mean by a subsidy? Our starting point is the World Trade Organization definition, and what you see here is a foreshortened version, leaving out some of the extraneous legalese text. And basically, it's two types. One is a financial contribution by a government, and it's what most people think of as a subsidy would be what the WTO would call a grant, and that's part of the category of direct transfers of funds. But that also includes other things like loans and equity infusions. So that's when the government actually takes a share in a otherwise a commercial enterprise, and or it involves a potential direct transfer of funds. So a very common form of support for financing is called a loan guarantee. The government says, yeah, if the company receiving the loan defaults, we guarantee that the bank will be repaid. Another category, a big category, is government revenue that's otherwise due, that would otherwise be due, is foregone or not collected. And so that covers a whole category of tax incentives. So in other words, the government has a program which it taxes certain goods or certain types of industries, and it gives us a special lower rate or exempts those goods or industries. And another one is the government provides goods or services, and that would be, for example, that it would say, okay, to a plant, you can put your plant here in this government-owned land, and we won't charge you any rent. Then the second major category is there's income or price support, and so this might be, for example, through the government setting the price of an important input, be it a feedstock or energy, and that artificially keeps the price lower than the market price. But in all of these, as the WTO says, and a benefit is thereby conferred. So, for example, the government could certainly have some kind of, for example, as land, and it lets a plant locate on that. But if it charges the full market value for that land, then it's not a subsidy because there's no net benefit to the recipient. And they're paying what they would pay in a market situation. So the second question maybe is, why should we be interested in subsidies to plastics? Well, traditionally in the trade world, which is the main community that's typically been concerned about plastics until the last couple of decades, it's been the trade effects, and so if a government subsidizes its domestic industry, it probably lowers its costs, it makes it more competitive versus the industries in other countries. And the way that the rules work is it's typically that it causes a competitiveness problem with a similar good, or what's called a like good. And so it might be that the government that feels as if another country's subsidies are damaging it, they would say, well, this country is subsidizing polystyrene packaging, and that's competing with our domestic producers unfairly because they're subsidizing it. But of course, very often the bigger trade impact, but not covered so easily by the rules, is competition with unlike products. So polystyrene packaging versus, for example, cardboard packaging. And so what we're concerned with, and I think the most of the environmental community is that to what extent is subsidization of plastics making it harder for plastic alternatives to compete. So then there's and finance people are often also concerned about subsidies, and that because if they're looking at government budgets and they think of what's called the opportunity cost, what else could be done with that money, and that's come up, for example, a lot in the case of fossil fuel subsidies, where you have some countries that are heavily subsidizing the consumption of fossil fuels, but that the total amount of that is actually in some countries been greater than that for funding of education. And the big reason now for looking at subsidies to plastics is the environmental effects. If you're stimulating production or consumption or both, and that can lead to higher levels of pollution because you're basically making it cheaper, relatively cheaper, and probably increasing production. So just a reminder that plastics also interact with other subsidized industries, in particular agriculture and fishing. And so these are just pictures here. If you can see, these used to be called glass houses. Very few are typically now made with glass, and more often made with plastic sheeting. There's some areas of places like Spain and so forth where hundreds of hectares or even multiple square kilometers are covered with these plastic greenhouses. And then you have plastic mulching, that's on the bottom. In fishing, you have everything from plastic lures for recreational fishing to huge nets that are made with synthetic fibers. And then just the last one, cement. This shows a picture of a massive pile of mainly plastic municipal waste, and that's now being used as a fuel in some cement making. So it's also helpful to have an idea of the whole plastic cycle and what we're looking at here. And so on the left, to the left of the dotted line is when people talk about subsidies to the production of fossil fuels. That's what they're talking about. And on the red are the subsidies to consumption. So that would be the flows of underpriced fuels directly or indirectly through electricity. And at the beginning of the upstage upper stages of production of plastic are basically taking certain primary chemicals from oil refining or the processing of natural gas and turning them into what are called alkenes, which is ethylene, propylene, and et cetera. And then those basic building blocks are then knitted together. That's the polymerization process. Then that gets those polymers get mixed with other chemicals and further processed, and you have finished polymers which get made into plastic products and then final use. And you can see that you have a lot of energy going into particularly the steam cracking and the polymerization part, and that's what the initial work that we've been doing is focused on is to what extent are those inputs to the production process subsidized. So Zara had mentioned the $45 billion a year. That was basically $43 billion in the price support for chemical feedstocks and feedstock energy. Plus we said, well, I mean, certainly we know that other subsidies are at least $2 billion. So let's, to be conservative, round it up to $45 billion. And so that's the part of the stage that we were looking at. Not counting, though, for example, subsidies to the capital that goes into building these plants, but just the input subsidies. So that's what I want to talk about here is what we're working on now, what we're calling phase 3 of the project, and just a few examples of the types of subsidies that we're seeing. And one big one in the United States, particularly in Texas and Louisiana, and to some extent in some other states, you have these programs which basically exempt these big petrochemical complexes from local taxes, and it might be 10 years, 15 years, whatever. And so one of the biggest ones is this plant that was finished in about 5 or 6 years ago in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And these plants, it's important to understand these plants are enormous investments, some of the biggest single investments in the world. And this complex was $20 billion. I mean, it's just hard to even get one's mind around the size of that. And so the tax break associated that was almost $3.5 billion. So that's basically about 15%. Another one, this was the plant that ended up with the largest subsidy in Pennsylvania history since the Second World War. And this plant, which uses natural gas liquids derived from fracked gas in southwestern Pennsylvania and that region, built by Shell. It's that capital cost was $14 billion, and they got total tax breaks of $1.6 billion, which includes a large part of that is basically a rebate for buying natural gas that's been produced in state. Here's a picture of one in Canada. Canada has one of the, in terms of percentage of the input to these plants, has one of the biggest programs out there. This was a plant that basically pulls out propane from from the natural gas stream, and then what's called dehydrogenates it into propylene, which is the monomer, the basic building block, and then produces from which polymers, polypropylene is produced. That one is a more typical plant of a capital investment of about, that's 4 billion Canadian dollars, a bit less than US dollars. And the basically, this is a grant. So this is not just a loan, but an actual grant. And the program under which of about 0.4 billion. So that was about 10%. But the program under which this is given will give up to 12%, 12%, just pure gift to the investor. Now, I mean, it's not only in North America you have these, you have these types of things all over the world. And here's an interesting one, again, scale of about $4 billion investment in Uzbekistan. And this involved a large number of both the multilateral development banks, so the Asian Development Bank of 0.4 billion, so about 10%, again, but this is a loan, it's not a grant. And then a much larger tranche from a consortium of investors. Now, what's interesting about this plant is that it came online, I think, about 2017. And then there was a devaluation of the currency and other problems. And these investors basically, a bunch of Korean investors had to wait 7 years before they got, they were owed $1 billion in royalties and other payments from this. And they had to wait 7 years until finally there was the heads of the governments met up and said, we got to figure out some way to, give a return on investment here. So these plants, to show these plants are risky. So this one is, I think, my penultimate slide, and the question of why people might be saying, well, why are governments subsidizing this? They're not thinking so much about the environment, they're thinking about value added. So how much more economic activity can we get out of these basic fossil fuels, particularly if they're fossil fuel producers? And so ethane, which is something, like I said, you can get out of the natural gas stream, and you look at the price of that, so it goes from $80 to $90 per ton, all the way up to the finished product of like $2,500 to $3,700 a ton. And this is not value added, but the value added is a big portion of this, and generally the margin, the profit margin on the finished products gets bigger the more processing it undergoes. And I included this quote from a study. Let's see if I can get covered here. But basically oops, wrong. Am I showing my face?
We can see your slides still.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it says the petrochemical industry is characterized by significantly higher growth rates than most other sectors of the economy. It is the highest capital expenditure per worker ratio among the manufacturing industries, generating the second highest value after the pharmaceutical industry. So that's what all of these, particularly emerging economies, are looking for, is this value added. So I'll just end with, so why isn't more being done to curb subsidies to plastics? And well, partially is until recently, nobody was really thinking about them, and there weren't. I mean, there were a few people who were looking at them, but there wasn't really much effort at the global scale. No intergovernmental organization was trying to quantify these, and so this is one of the reasons why we saw this gap, an information gap. We in Eunomia and are now trying to bring that information to light. And also because, as I mentioned in the past, when you've had disciplines on subsidies, it's more been motivated by the trade effects, and whereas in the case of plastics is as important or more is the environmental effect. And it's only been recently, for example, that the World Trade Organization has been willing to create rules to try to constrain subsidies because of their environmental effects much more than their trade effects. But still, the existing WTO rules and institutions have not been very effective against subsidies to plastics. And as you've heard, there are new international negotiations on, and we're glad to hear that the youth groups are pressing also to maintain language on that, on subsidies in the final document. So thank you very much. That, I hope, provides a segue to what Alexandra Harrington is going to be talking about.
Thank you very much, Ronald. And that was really, really insightful. And thank you very much for telling us about the scale of plastic subsidies. It really is illuminating. Thank you as well for all of your work with Kuno and Eunomia in putting the numbers behind this issue so that we can all better understand the scale of plastic subsidies and highlight the need for change. So, moving on, I'd like to welcome Dr. Alexandra Harrington, who has been an incredible mentor to me and to so many other youth in the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP community. By hosting the MEA Bootcamp, her continuous support of the youth community during the Plastics Treaty negotiations, and so much more, she really is a champion for the youth voice. She's an international law expert, author, scholar, and consultant, specializing in topics such as international organizations, environmental law, sustainable development law, corporate social responsibility, international trade law, human rights law, and transitional justice. So, hello, Alexandra, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really, thank you, to Ashton, to everyone for the invitation to be here, and also just the chance to participate again more broadly in discussions with so many friendly faces and faces who I've missed since we did the boot camp. Frankly, it's been a while, but I've missed so many of you and seeing you several times a week. So it's lovely to see you all.
And thank you very much for joining us once again.
Oh, no, of course, absolutely. And I am hoping to see many of you in Geneva very soon and share the lovely weather and perhaps a coffee or two, as well as the actual negotiations. And coming after Ron is always quite difficult because Ron is always just so captivating and I always learn much from him. So it's a hard thing to do. But we will certainly try to have a wee bit of a discussion. I will learn to share my screen again, make sure it works. And this is really intended to give us a bit of a context as to where and how we will find the references to subsidies, as well as briefly trade. I'll touch on trade, but we'll really get much more towards subsidies. In the iterations that we have seen of the compilation document, as well as where they either are or are not present in the chair's non-papers, the multiple iterations that we do have, and also quickly to connect up. And I know it's a lot of information, and I know it's a lot of very technical information, but quickly at least to connect up where we find analogous or important elements in WTO, World Trade Organization, agreements and law, so that when we think about the question of subsidies in the plastics context, we think about it from a legal perspective that understands, yes, indeed, there are references to subsidies that could be applicable in the World Trade Organization context, but also that we know how these work briefly, and also that they do not necessarily form a barrier to including this type of provision in our current project, which is the Plastics Treaty, and also how trade links into that as well. And I think it's very important for us to have this at least flying overview, in the sense that it is an issue that tends to come up a great deal when we are talking in the negotiations themselves about things like including language on plastic subsidies, also language on trade, but things like international cooperation and topics such as regime convergence, etc. So that's why I really do want to share as much as of the information that I have with you as I can. And then if we have other questions, we will certainly figure out how best to address them as we move forward. So if I may take those of you who have been on this experience and this journey of INC processes back a bit to Ottawa, and then the outcome of Ottawa, which is already well over a year ago, and that doesn't seem possible, but it is. When we had the compilation document, which came out of Ottawa, where we actually had the negotiations based on the revised zero draft coming out of Nairobi. And of course, that was preceded by the zero draft, which was used in negotiations in Nairobi, and that informed us a great deal as well. But when we had the compilation document, it was 72 approximately pages. With more brackets than any of us could, I think, ever expect to see or would ever want to see again. But when we had it and we looked through it, we would easily see, and we will see today if we continue to look at it, that subsidies were present in the compilation document. They certainly were present in the zero draft and the revised zero draft. And there was only a limited discussion in the intercessional period, but still they were very much present in the compilation document. And whilst the chair's non-paper, the first iteration of the chair's non-paper, and then the subsequent iterations from the 29th of December during INC 5.1, and then from the 1st of December during INC 5.1 replaced in many ways the aspects of the chair's non-paper and the compilation document as the basis documents for negotiations. It is still very important to understand when we came to Busan what had been said about subsidies up until that point. Because we had up until that point 4 rounds of negotiations. We had 2 years where we had a number of different options developed and views developed as reflected in the compilation document, so that we then came in with a knowledge far greater than we certainly had started with in terms of where subsidies both directly and indirectly connected. And again, for those of you who either were involved but have moved on from the compilation document to the chair's non-papers, or for those of you who are new to the process, a bit of a reminder in that when we looked at the compilation document, the core obligations really were contained in part 2 of that document. And we saw a number of references to subsidies, both overtly and also rather covertly or indirectly, throughout that part. And indeed, in the very beginning, in part 2.1, there was a proposal to include specific references to subsidies per se in binding aspects of control measures that would regulate either primary plastic polymers or primary and secondary plastic polymers, depending on the iteration. But there was always a reference in that document and in that part to including subsidies when we're thinking about how we define and how we regulate plastic polymers at the very least under the terms of what we all are hoping very soon will be a plastics treaty. And again, this was not agreed on necessarily in many ways, including the fact that there were mandatory and voluntary elements, but it certainly was there, and it was an important element to give us an understanding of how subsidies do connect or could connect with textual proposals that had been made up until that point. We also saw a very important connection being made in Part 2, subsection 13, on transparency and on issues such as not only transparency, monitoring, etc., but also tracking mechanisms and measures and labeling measures. And there was a proposal that state parties, so the states that join the treaty process, not only those who are negotiating now, but anyone who wants to join in the future, it's a reminder for everyone who was in the boot camps, be able to include in their obligations subsidy use and reporting and information provisions, which I think Ron highlighted very well why we need these and what we need these to be. That would include things like what phase out measures were being taken, what reduction or removal measures were being taken at national level, so that in the future it would have been possible under that level of transparency and monitoring to understand where the obligations were on countries to report and then see what their reporting was as to how quickly they were able to phase out subsidies, whether they were able to phase out right away, whether they had to reduce first or remove in a more coordinated fashion. So that would really have been quite interesting and quite useful in many ways to allow us to also understand some of the data that Ron presented, and also some of the areas where we currently have data gaps in terms of understanding what subsidies are in the plastics context. Related to this, there had been an Annex X provision, subsidy related provision, that would look at each stage of the life cycle and potentially would have required various types of subsidy reform information being given throughout the plastics life cycle. Now, again, these are things from the compilation document. And there was the decision made very early on in Busan in the plenary opening session to use the chair's non-paper as the document for discussion and negotiation, with the understanding that anything that came from the compilation document or any other proposals from states would of course be able to be offered by state parties as potential elements for inclusion, because this is the right of states who are members in the negotiating process to indeed to do, and it is within the prerogative of states to make any proposals at INC 5.1 as it will be in INC 5.2. The chair's non-paper itself does not reference subsidies. So if you're looking through the textual proposal that has been made, it is indeed far shorter than the 72 pages of the compilation document. And it has a number of brackets, but not as many just by sheer volume alone. But it does not include specific references to subsidies. And the subsequent iterations that we saw issued on the 29th of November and the 1st of December also did not contain references to subsidies. What does this mean in practice? What this means is that if we are thinking potentially of a treaty that could include specific language on subsidies, it would have to be reintroduced or reproposed by a state or a group of states throughout the negotiating process. So during INC 5.2 itself. And certainly that is possible. It is indeed, as I mentioned, the right of states. Let me go back for 1 second. The right of states to do this, but it is something to be aware of. And as we discuss subsidies, I think it's very important for us to know that certainly the plastics industry is very heavily linked to subsidies, so that we can then understand why many countries argued from the beginning, from INC 1 onwards, that subsidies should be included in several places, or at least in the very least in the preamble of the treaty itself, in order to be able to gather information and also place some type of perhaps more market leveling and environmentally oriented policies within the treaty as it relates to production and subsidies. So just quickly to point out that there are connections directly with subsidies in the WTO context, as well as in potentially the plastics context or the plastics negotiation context. That is very true, and you will hear a great deal, and if you especially were in Busan, you will probably recall having heard a great deal about some concerns as to whether or not this would be a direct conflict. So whether we would have to leave subsidies out, for example, of the treaty text if the WTO has agreements as it does. So, for example, these subsidies and countervailing measures, the SCM agreement, that relate to subsidies overall as a genre rather than only those relating to plastics. And the answer, quite simply, looking at a various set of the treaty provisions itself, for the SCM, for the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, is that that is not necessarily the case, and that having a large umbrella agreement, as we do in many contexts for WTO laws and rules under many headings, from public health and phytosanitary measures to fishing subsidies, etc., does not mean that the international community is barred from having any type of further clarification or further measure in another treaty that specifically relates to trade when it is in the subsidies context. And what we do have to do is look at what is in the WTO agreement, which we certainly have done, and in the work that I've been very lucky to do with Ron and with the Quaker United Nation office with CUNO. Some people such as Andres Naranjo who are on this call today, is to look at this and really to point out that there are not competing views, that the definitions used are not competing, and that the provisions used themselves in terms of how we define subsidies and their prohibitions could actually be used in a way in the plastics context that would further the goals of the WTO agreement in and of itself. So just to highlight that, so that if you do hear these points coming up, you have an understanding of what some of that background is, and ways that you can think about subsidies in that context without violating WTO law. And very quickly, just to touch on the issue of trade, because we often see subsidies linked with trade. And we see an understanding that subsidies and trade often go hand in hand. After all, if you are subsidizing as a government any type of industry, presumably you are subsidizing it with the hope that it will go on the international market as well, and not only in the national market. So you're trying to have that nexus kind of from the beginning. But what we saw in the compilation document was actually a dedicated provision, a dedicated article that related to trade in potentially chemicals, polymers, products that are or are comprised of plastics. And this would have been a very potentially wide-ranging, either voluntary or mandatory, depending on which iteration we looked at, option that in many ways mimicked a number of other provisions we see in things like the Biodiversity Convention and its associated protocols, as well as in things such as the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention groupings, where we do see that there are licensing and import and export restriction requirements for various types of identified chemicals, hazardous waste, etc. So this was not something that necessarily was new or without precedent, and it did indeed at one point have its own article. Unfortunately, at the moment, or unfortunately for those who were supportive of it, I should say, at the moment, the dedicated article itself was removed from the compilation document. From the compilation document was removed from the iterations of the chair's non-papers. So at the moment, we don't have that intersection and that nexus. And we also don't have a number of the other elements that were connecting directly from the compilation document to trade. So specific references such as trade in chemicals of concern, trade in microplastics, and product design and trade, as well as again the digital tracking and the marking elements in the transparency proposal, and also aspects of reporting that had included trade as well as subsidies in the compilation document. Again, what this means is that we do have a brief window in a sense. There were some voluntary trade measures that were referenced in the initial non-paper, and there were some elements that would potentially allow for a connection with reporting and trade, which is marginally better, many would argue, than the status of subsidies, since there are no subsidies references at this point. But still, it is a very important topic to link. And certainly there will most likely be a discussion of trade in some capacity during the INC 5.2 debates and discussions as well. So just to give you an understanding that there has been a buildup up until the non-papers, there had been a buildup of a number of different states that had made their own proposals about what trade-related language would look like potentially, as well as subsidy-related language. And again, perhaps obviously, since it is the World Trade Organization, the WTO itself does work on establishing a trade agreement based system that would also include a number of different aspects of trade policy, potentially including those that relate to plastics. But there is nothing in the GATT, which is the foundational text, as well as many of the other subsequent agreements that would bar the inclusion of trade-related measures as long as they are written in a way that does comply with WTO, et cetera. And I just would end by pointing out that another reason to have this discussion and to be aware of the nexuses with subsidies and trade and plastics and those ongoing negotiations, as well as WTO, is that approximately 142 out of the entirety of the states in the current INC process are also members of the WTO. So making sure that we are aware of these connections, making sure that we are aware of the potential positive ways that including language on subsidies and language on trade could actually allow this vast majority of countries to meet their obligations under WTO while also furthering the goals of the Plastics Treaty. And Resolution 5.14 is really something that I think could be very beneficial as we're coming down to hopefully the end of the treaty creation process, and then we go to implementation. But that is another discussion for another time. So I am very happy to end and hand the floor back to you, Zara. Thank you so very much for all of your attention, everyone, and again, great to see you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you for, as always, a very informative presentation. And thank you as well for all that you do to promote a stronger plastics treaty, including one that addresses plastic subsidies and trade. Finally, I'd like to welcome Kervin Lanyas. He currently works as a project manager of circular economy and sustainability programs at Panama's Ministry of Environment. In this role, he serves as a technical liaison for various national and international initiatives, contributes to the development of national regulations, and promotes good environmental practices in the private sector. He also represents Panama in the United Nations International Negotiating Committee, or INC, which is developing a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. Thank you very much for joining us, Kervin. We're thrilled to have you here, and welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for having us here in this space. We are very happy to be with you all. I hope you are hearing me very well. And also I want to
Yes.
thank Ronald. Awesome. I also want to thank Ronald and Alexandra for those explanations, and think you bring very important information that could help us not just in the understanding of the situation, but also we could help us into the preparation for the ISE 5.2. So I will try to share my screen. Now I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes. Awesome. So I would like to start just having some insight on what is the situation here in Panama and what we are dealing with when we talk about plastics, our plastic market. Here in Panama, plastic market is primarily import-based. In recent years, our total trade in plastic has averaged exceed over $500 million, and the majority of these imports consist of finished plastic products from direct consumption, and also some plastic resins which are used in the manufacturing process of these final plastic products to be consumed or also export to other countries. In this context, statistics data indicate that Panama's current tariff structure and foreign investment policies have facilitated the entry of small plastics imports on the heavily favored conditions. These are classified into categories, for example, of duty-free, typically for special regimes such as free trade zones, also imports granted exceptions status, and also others under FTAs, uh, specialist, which covers imports benefits from preferential traffics on their free trade arrangements. From 2017 to 2021, these flavor duty categories collectively accounted for approximately 70% of all plastic imports into the country. This scenario illustrates the presence of implicit subsidies that currently favor the importation of plastics to the country, while we are making some progress in setting national commitments and laws and other national base to combat plastic pollution. Our trade and traffic structure remain misleaded with this goal that we are planning for our country. To ensure the effectiveness of our policies, it is crucial to review and reform these economic incentives. Otherwise, we risk continuing to import consume plastics under conditions that perpetual dependency and have those environment harms that we already consider that are part of the plastic pollution. Rather than encourage local innovation, reuse systems, and sustainability alternative for a more environmentally friendly market. Then, when we talk about the impacts and what opportunities are considered for all as developing countries or small member states, we can consider that plastic subsidies are a critical drive of plastic pollution, particularly affecting us as developing countries. As negotiations continue towards a legally binding treaty on plastic pollution, it is essential to address the economic and environmental disadvantage that these type of subsidies or that arise from these subsidies. First, the current support mechanism favor large case products in major economies. This distortion the global market. Developing nations as us cannot compete with the subsidized polymers and plastic products, which floods the market with these cheap plastics. And then this dependency weakness local industry, as I mentioned, in the development of possible sustainable alternative and have those significantly economic disadvantage. Secondly, the environmental burden of plastics span from their entire life cycle that we consider that this is just from the fossil fuel extraction all the way to the end of the end of life disposal, including consumption and all of the risks and leakages that could happen throughout all this life cycle. From countries with limited waste management like us, infrastructure, the growing influence of subsidiary plastic intensifies pollution pressure. And despite some countries that have like a well-resourced structure, infrastructure for waste management, they still have a lot of plastic leakage into environment. So that presents us that just downstream measures aren't enough to tackle properly all the pollution. Then when we talk about the treaty, as Alexandra just mentioned, we have a lot of iterations and changes on the process that sadly water down the consideration, not just on subsidies, but also in trade that are very important, as I just mentioned, for the national market in Panama around plastic, as we base mostly in trade model of plastic products and primary plastic recycling. And in this consideration, the treaty for us must clearly stand that we need to take some actions to reduce this impact that generate from harmful plastic subsidies. For example, we can phase out subsidies through our binding commitments that used to have in the previous iteration of the text. We could also redirect public support towards circular economy solutions or other sustainable alternative, and gradually shift harmful subsidies toward implementation funds, for example, those that need to be applied under Article 11 on means of implementation in the treaty. Also, it's important to evaluate the provision of offsetting mechanism, which obscure responsibility and delay meaningful reductions. Importantly, reconfirming subsidies presents a real opportunity. A well-designed financial support system focused on capacity building, innovation, and equitable transition, and a just transition for everybody, can help level the playing field for developing countries with disadvantaged global reduction of goals. Also, within the negotiation, we are working with other countries and other delegations to see how we can strengthen the text. For example, bringing back some of the trade consideration that we used to have in the treaty, mostly in Article 5 on product design, and also evaluate how we could strengthen the consideration of those subsidies that need to be tackled, considered, and could be taken into consideration within the text. And also thanks to Alexandra for those examples on how this is not this could be taken into consideration with the WHO rules, and how this could be aligned and have a proper application to reduce this possibility of plastic pollution that comes with this extended subsidies for plastics. So thank you, everybody. This was like a very, very short intervention, but we are really aligned to participate in this discussion and help and strengthen more so that we can on the text to ensure that we properly take some actions on control, not just in the primary plastic pollution, but also around all the life cycle of plastics to properly attack or eliminate plastic pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Curving, and thank you so much for joining us today amid your very busy schedule right now, and also for all that Panama is doing in the INC process. And also some really informative insights from a member state's perspective on this global issue in relation to the Plastics Treaty. So thank you very much. So we will open up for questions in just a minute. I know we've ran a little over time, but before then, or a little over time on the speakers, so we'll have slightly less time for questions. But before then, I'd like to take this space to announce Hidden Plastics' new petition. In this petition, we're asking the chair to reinstate plastic subsidies into the treaty text. It's an open letter that has currently been posted in collaboration with the Plastic Pollution Coalition and Beyond Plastics. If you agree that plastic subsidies should be addressed in the treaty text, then we would like to request if you could sign and share through your networks. It only takes a minute, but your support could have a huge impact on the future of plastic pollution. We need as much help as possible from everyone to spread the word and get this in front of the INC chair. I believe Ashton is about to post the link in the chat, and if you would be willing to sign, we'd really appreciate this. Now, we'd like to open up for the Q&A, which we'll have around 20 minutes for. If you have any questions, either for a specific speaker or in general, please feel free to raise your hand. Or if you prefer, you can type them in the Zoom chat. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible in the time we have, so please don't hesitate to ask. While we go through the questions, we'll also have some more Zoom poll questions that will appear on your screen, and we can review the responses before we close and take a final group photo. So, I think the Zoom polls just popped up, and we can start with the first questions. Let's see. So I think I'm going to dive right in. So for curving, what role does collecting data on plastic for curving, do you believe that subsidies can be used as a tool to help countries that are heavily impacted by plastic pollution like Panama?
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I think it's a proper opportunity, as you mentioned, for example, in the case of Panama, our mostly our market and our national market on plastic goes around trade and all those subsidies that help us get more of those plastics into the country. For example, here, just making some of the connection with the laws that we are trying to apply at a national level, we have our first law that ban a certain amount of single-use plastics, and those consider also the importation or export of those plastics into the country. And when we start to apply the regulation, we find out that is more expensive for an industry just to make a change on the little like juice that have that little straw, just to change that straw into another material, increase the cost of the introduction of those into the country. And we evaluate that for them to be of plastic, or this straw to be of plastics, it will be like really, really cheap in comparison. So we consider that as just an example of what's happening to us. But if we can regulate this as a global or as a more like broad implementation, we think this could be aligned with the trade measures that could help us, that we for countries that like us that aren't producers of plastic but are like mostly in the consumption side and has now a very dependent like use or have a dependency on the use of plastics on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Curving. And my next question is for Ronald, which is, what role does collecting data on plastic subsidies have on making more informed decisions?
Yes, hello. Good question. What we've seen is that oftentimes the international community doesn't really start to discuss imposing rules on the use of subsidies until there's at least some impression of their nature and scale. So in the case of agriculture, for example, the WTO agreement on agriculture, it was only after my former employer, the OECD, brought together a lot of information on subsidies to agriculture that the major subsidizers woke up and said, yeah, we're basically in a subsidy war, and this is not helping the industry, and it's costing us a lot. Same thing happened with fisheries, and that I was involved with at the OECD also was we had several countries come to us and say, we'd like to know what is the size and nature of these subsidies. And then within a year after we came out with a report on that, there was actually a negotiating mandate at the WTO to start negotiating a WTO agreement on subsidies to fisheries. So it's never been necessary to have all the details to get a conversation going, but it is important to have at least a rough idea of both the magnitude and the nature. And I mean, without it, then the countries that are opposed to talking about it just basically say, well, what subsidies? Give me an example, so.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, my next question is for Alexandra, which is, are there any other multilateral environmental agreements that address subsidies? I think you touched a bit on this with the World Trade Organization. And if so, could we look back at them for reference, perhaps?
It is such an excellent question, Sarah. Thank you. So yes, obviously, I mean, the WTO clearly does in terms of having a specific agreement that is on subsidies and countervailing measures. But as I had pointed out before, it doesn't necessarily act as a prohibiting function. It really does. If we look back at it, it does have a specific role, which is to regulate the use of subsidies and countervailing measures, which is a whole other different discussion and not really as much for the plastics context. But it was not meant to be a bar. So I think that's the first thing to understand. It was not meant to be a bar for the development of any future type of international law in environmental or other contexts, provided that everyone obviously meets that standard and there isn't a specific provision in, say, the plastics treaty or anything else that would bar or tamper with the applicability of that agreement. I do also think it's important to highlight, as I referenced briefly, that we have a number of different environmental treaties, what we call MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements, that do have subsidies references and also do have trade provisions. And so it's not unique, it's not unusual. Obviously, plastic is itself unique because it is an environmental harm, which we regulate already in many other fora, but it is such a complex thing that it does really require its own treaty in many ways. But the idea of regulating subsidies and regulating trade within a WTO compliant separate treaty is not new. And we do have a number of those examples. We have everything from the Minamata Convention, which is one of the most recent ones that has been adopted in the plastics context, to some older, I say older, but I think of them in there. For you, they will be much older with members of the youth. For some of us, they're not that old, but anyway, the Convention on Biological Diversity and its associated protocols does have this type of provisions. There are elements in the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. So we do have those things to draw on. It's just a question of making sure that we draw on them, obviously, properly and in a way that is in compliance with not only WTO, but also then other obligations that might come up under other treaties. But it's something that many of us are quite used to doing because it's the way that many international lawyers work. So it shouldn't be seen as something that is off-putting or that automatically should make us all go, oh, no, we can't touch it. That's it. It really isn't that at all. And I'm sure Ron will have even more pithy responses than mine. So Ron, please, I'm very curious.
If it's okay, Zara, I was just going to say that there have been many, well, not many, but is several agreements that have been negotiated outside the WTO that try to discipline. So I've been using this word, but basically impose restrictions on the use of subsidies. And one of the earliest was something called the Paris Treaty, which formed the European Coal and Steel Community way back in the early 1950s, and that actually prohibited virtually most subsidies on steel and coal within the 6 European members who signed that. Much more recently, you have something called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability between Costa Rica, Iceland, New Zealand, and Switzerland. That actually has disciplines on their uses of fossil fuel subsidies. Then you have, and Alexander is probably more familiar than I am on various languages, language in a number of free trade agreements or regional trade agreements. One is the CCTPP that has some language disciplining subsidies to fisheries. So it's certainly been it wouldn't be totally strange to have something in an MEA.
Thank you, Alexandra and Ronald, and some good points there. I think it's really good to know that we do have those kind of frameworks we could perhaps rely on, even though they're a different scenario. So I think we have time for one more question, which this one's for all of the panelists, and this is for all of the panelists. And as this is the Children and Youth Major Group to UNEP, we'd like to ask, what role can the younger generation play in supporting the inclusion of subsidies in the treaty text?
And I see silence from everyone else. So Zara, shall I jump in and just start
Okay.
this? And I think
Oh.
You've already done it. You know, you've just launched a petition, and I think you're already doing a really big part of it right there. And hosting events like this, and also being present at the INCs, and making sure that your voices are heard. We in Busan, for those of us who were lucky enough to be there and to hear this particular moment, I'm going to say something about Shellen, because I know she's on the call, and I know that she will probably be angry with me for doing this, but she gave a wonderful intervention at a very critical moment during the INC plenary process, and really highlighted the role of plastics on youth and in the lives of youth, in a way that I think it is easy for anyone who is involved in the negotiations to lose sight of often. When you're having intensive arguments, especially legal arguments, where we're having arguments about things like the placement of a comma, or whether we use a comma or a semicolon. When you're arguing at that level, it doesn't allow you to focus on the fact that you're arguing for that, because you're trying to protect not only yourself and your own generation, but also in your country, but the future generation and the youth. And so having that voice is, to me, the most critical thing, and being present and just explaining the impacts on you, and for all of you not being intimidated by the fact that you are young, and knowing that that is a gift for many of us to hear from. I think that's the way that you can make the biggest impact. But I'm also your mentor, so I feel like I have to tell you that anyway.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. And it does feel like a once, kind of not just once in a lifetime, but once in a planet opportunity, this treaty. So it does seem important to have more of the youth voice, which is exciting to see it's growing. I've just noticed some more questions in the chat. So maybe I can do one more, quickly squeeze in for whoever's able to do it. This one's from Kelvin, I think, Maina. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, which is, how can the member states fight local corporations that may lobby actors to fight against the inclusion of plastic subsidies, of the cancellation of plastic subsidies? Okay, go ahead, Ronald, please.
Yeah, just to, I mean, a basic short answer is that what we've seen in past ones is that and maybe more at the domestic scale than at the international is at the domestic scale, there have usually been some trade-offs. You know, for example, in the case, New Zealand was one of the first countries that really phased out its subsidies to agriculture, and basically the government said, look, you know, yes, we're going to end this, but there's going to be much broader a macroeconomic change, and in the end, you'll benefit from having better access to markets. You know, you'll have a cleaner environment, et cetera, et cetera. They included it among a broader package to try to show you know, both the workers and the industry itself, that there would be benefits from the reform. And I think that's the general thing that has to be done. So if you can get countries to see that that this is something that all of they can do, and that's maybe a bit of a problem, because it's a much narrower number of countries that are major subsidizers of plastics. But you know, to show that they're that embedded in a broader package that can show that that the benefits will be shared widely. That's not probably a very good answer, but
That was very good, Ronald. Thank you. I think, yeah, definitely kind of the lobbying that occurs from kind of corporations can definitely be a little bit difficult. But yeah, it'd be great to see kind of how this is being overcome in the treaty. So I think that's all we have time for on the questions. Thank you very much, everyone, and some very insightful responses too. Just a quick reminder that Hidden Plastic has now officially launched our petition calling for the chair to reintroduce plastic subsidies to the treaty text. and also that the Youth and Stakeholder Assembly will be taking place in Geneva on the 4th of August, which will include the launch of the Youth Plastic Action Network, or YPAN, which will be the official CYMG affiliation for the Global Plastics Treaty. I think, Ashton, if you could possibly add both to the comments, that would be fantastic. And if not, we'll send them, and we'll also send them in the follow-up email if anyone's interested. Also to note, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube and sent to registrants in a follow-up email, so you can rewatch if you wish or share through your networks. I think we already took a group photo, so that should be great. And I think that's a wrap. A huge thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here today. I hope you've all found it insightful, and of course, a huge thanks to our amazing speakers for sharing their expertise and taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you all. Congratulations, everyone. Hope to see you soon.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Actually, I just about the financing bill has put out a national
Thank you.
made to
Thank you.
and